The elevator doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and I felt my son Michael's hand tighten on my arm. Not protective but possessive. The smell of industrial disinfectant burned my nostrils as we descended into what felt like my grave. "Mom, you'll love it here," Michael said, his voice too bright, too rehearsed. "Sunny Gardens has the best reputation in the state." I said nothing. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting shadows across his face that made him look like a stranger. But then again, maybe he always had been. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're hooked already, a like and subscribe will keep these stories coming. The elevator jolted to a stop, and those doors opened to reveal a lobby that took my breath away. Not because it was beautiful, though it was with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but because I remembered choosing every detail 37 years ago. The hand-painted murals of English gardens. The imported Italian tiles. Even the scent of lavender that drifted from hidden diffusers. This was Sunny Gardens Retirement Community. And I was Clarissa Penrose, its founder. Mrs. Penrose. A young woman in scrubs approached us, clipboard in hand. "I'm Janet, one of the nurses. We're so excited to welcome you to your new home." New home. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. Michael had orchestrated this whole charade 3 months ago, convincing my daughter Sarah, who lived clear across the country, that I was becoming unstable. Forgetting to turn off the stove. Getting lost driving to the grocery store. Classic signs of dementia. He'd said with such authority that even I almost believed him. Except none of it was true. I'd been testing him, leaving little traps around the house. Moving things slightly out of place to see if he'd notice during his increasingly frequent check-ins. Recording our conversations on my phone when something felt off. And slowly, piece by piece, I discovered the truth. Michael wasn't worried about my health. He was worried about his inheritance. "The paperwork's all been filed," Michael was saying to Janet. His hand still gripping my arm. "Power of attorney, medical proxy, everything's in order." I watched Janet's face carefully. She was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. She had no idea she was witnessing a kidnapping dressed up as elder care. "And Mrs. Penrose," Janet turned to me with a warm smile. "How are you feeling about the transition?" "Terrified," I said honestly. Michael's grip tightened. "She's been having some confusion lately. The doctors think a structured environment will help." "Of course," Janet nodded sympathetically. "It's completely normal to feel anxious about change. But I promise we'll take wonderful care of you here." If only she knew how personal that promise was. As Janet led us through the main corridor, I let my eyes drift over details that would mean nothing to anyone else but everything to me. The way the afternoon light hit the windows at just the right angle. I'd spent weeks with the architect calculating that. The sound of water trickling from the fountain in the center courtyard. I'd insisted on that specific stone because Edmund, my late husband, had loved the way water sounded on granite. Every step felt like walking through my own ghost. "Here's the dining room," Janet was saying, gesturing to a spacious area filled with round tables and upholstered chairs. "Meals are served at 6, 12, and 5, but there's always coffee and snacks available." An elderly man at one of the tables looked up as we passed. His eyes, sharp and intelligent despite his age, focused on me with sudden recognition. I saw his mouth open slightly, then close as he glanced between Michael and me with obvious concern. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, from people who remembered the old days when Edmund and I first opened Sunny Gardens. When we'd pour our hearts and our life savings into creating something special for people who deserved dignity in their golden years. "The residents here seem so content," Michael observed, his voice carrying that same false brightness that made my skin crawl. "Oh, they are," Janet beamed. "Mrs. Patterson has been here 8 years and says it's the best decision she ever made. And Mr. Henderson just celebrated his 90th birthday last month with his great-grandchildren." I remembered Mrs. Patterson. She'd been one of our first residents, a retired librarian who'd lost her husband and couldn't bear the silence of her empty house. And Mr. Henderson, I'd personally helped him plant roses in our memorial garden when his wife passed 5 years ago. These people weren't just residents. They were family. Now, let's see your room, Janet continued, leading us down a hallway lined with photographs of residents at various activities. Gardening club, book discussions, movie nights, all programs I'd designed to keep minds active and spirits lifted. My room, Michael had specifically requested it be on the ground floor, probably to make his story about my mobility issues more convincing, was spacious and bright, with a view of the rose garden. I'd stood in this exact spot dozens of times during construction, making sure the window placement would give residents something beautiful to wake up to. The bathroom has safety rails and an emergency call button, Janet explained, and your bed has adjustable settings for comfort. Very impressive, Michael said, checking his watch. Now, about the financial arrangements. Actually, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Penrose privately for a moment. We all turned to see a woman in her 50s standing in the threshold. She was impeccably dressed in a navy suit, her graying hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. My heart stopped. It was Victoria Walsh, the current director of Sunny Gardens, the woman who'd taken over when I'd stepped back 5 years ago to care for Edmund during his final illness. The woman who'd sent me monthly reports and thank you cards every Christmas. The woman who knew exactly who I was. I'm sorry, Michael stepped forward. But who are you? Victoria Walsh, director of Sunny Gardens, she said calmly, her eyes never leaving mine. It's standard procedure for me to meet personally with all new residents. I watched the recognition dawn slowly in her eyes, followed by confusion, then something that looked dangerously like anger. Mrs. Penrose, she said carefully, perhaps you'd like to sit down? My legs suddenly felt weak, not from age or infirmity, but from the sheer emotional weight of standing in the room I'd once dreamed would house people who needed love and care, not people who'd been abandoned by their own children. I sank into the armchair by the window, the same model I'd selected for every room because Edmund had tested them all and declared them perfect for afternoon reading. Now then, Victoria said, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous. Why don't we discuss how Mrs. Penrose came to be here? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Michael shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed a thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. As I explained to your staff, he said, my mother has been showing signs of cognitive decline. Her doctor recommended a supervised living environment. I see, Victoria nodded slowly. And which doctor would that be? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. I watched Michael's face go through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, calculation, then forced confidence. Dr. Richards at Mercy General, he said smoothly. I have all the paperwork in the car. How convenient. Victoria's voice was silk over steel. Janet, would you mind giving us some privacy? I need to discuss some sensitive matters with the family. Janet glanced between us uncertainly, then nodded and slipped out of the room. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere shifted completely. Victoria moved to the window and gazed out at the rose garden, her hands clasped behind her back. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Michael Penrose, she said without turning around, do you know who your mother really is? The question hit the room like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, and somewhere in my chest, my heart began hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Michael laughed nervously. She's my mother, Clarissa Penrose, a retired English teacher who founded this facility in 1987 with her late husband Edmund. Victoria turned slowly to face him, her expression deadly calm. Who designed every program we run, selected every piece of furniture in this building, and donated over $2 million to ensure that people like your mother would never have to fear abandonment in their old age. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the fountain in the courtyard 3 floors below. Michael's face had gone pale, then flushed red, then pale again. That's... He started then stopped. Started again. That's impossible. She's just a teacher. She doesn't have that kind of money. Victoria smiled, and it was the kind of smile that probably kept her awake at night when she had to fire incompetent staff members. Your mother, she said, never taking her eyes off Michael, is one of the most remarkable women I've ever known. She built this place from nothing because she believed every human being deserves dignity and care in their final years. And now her own son, her own flesh and blood, has tried to dump her here like she's nothing more than an inconvenience. I watched my son's face crumble as the reality of his situation began to sink in. All his careful plans, his forged documents, his manipulation of Sarah, none of it mattered now. He'd walked straight into the one place on earth where I was not just respected, but revered. Mom, he turned to me, his voice small and uncertain. Is this true? Before I could answer, Victoria spoke again. The real question, Michael, is what your mother wants to do about this. Because attempting to commit someone against their will, especially someone who's been declared competent by their own physician, the real Dr. Richards, who I called 20 minutes ago, well, that's a serious crime. She pulled out her phone and held it up so we could both see the screen. Should I call the police, Mrs. Penrose? Or would you prefer to handle this as a family matter? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, fed, clothed, loved, and sacrificed for, and saw not the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard, but a stranger who'd been willing to steal my freedom for money he hadn't even earned yet. The weight of that betrayal settled over me like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt truly tired. But then I thought about Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Henderson and all the other residents who'd found joy and community in this place I'd built. I thought about the young nurses like Janet who came to work every day believing they were making a difference. I thought about Victoria, who'd carried on Edmund's and my vision long after we'd stepped away. And I thought about what would happen if I let Michael get away with this. Not just to me, but to the next elderly parent who found themselves inconvenient to their children's plans. I stood up slowly, using the arms of the chair for support not because I needed to, but because I wanted Michael to remember this moment. I wanted him to remember the frail old woman he'd tried to discard, and contrast that image with what I was about to become. Victoria, I said, my voice steady and clear, I think it's time Michael learned who his mother really is. And that's when the lights went out. The emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie red shadows across the room. Through the window, I could see the entire facility had gone dark, all except for one building in the distance that still glowed with power. What the hell? Michael started, but Victoria's phone was already buzzing with calls. Power grid failure, she said, answering on the first ring. How bad is it, Tom? Her face grew grim as she listened. All of downtown. Is it? How long until backup generators kick in? I moved to the window, my heart sinking as I watched the chaos beginning to unfold outside. Residents were gathering in the courtyard, some in wheelchairs, others leaning heavily on walkers. The staff was doing their best to keep everyone calm, but I could see the fear in their faces. This wasn't just about my confrontation with Michael anymore. This was about 200 elderly residents who depended on electric medical equipment, climate control, and security systems that had just failed. The generators should have started by now, Victoria was saying into her phone, her voice tight with worry. Check the fuel lines. And Tom, get me a status report on all residents with critical medical needs. Michael stood frozen in the corner, probably realizing that his personal drama had just become insignificant compared to a potential disaster. But I wasn't thinking about Michael anymore. I was thinking about Mr. Henderson, who needed his oxygen concentrator. About Mrs. Patterson, whose heart medication was refrigerated. About the dozens of residents who would panic in the dark. The backup generators aren't responding, Victoria announced, hanging up. Something's wrong with the system. That's when it hit me. I knew exactly what was wrong. It's the new construction, I said, both of them turning to look at me in the red emergency lighting. 6 months ago they started building that medical complex next door. I saw the permits. They had to relocate the main power feed. Victoria's eyes widened. You think they damaged our backup system? Not damaged. Bypassed. I was already moving toward the door. When Edmund and I designed the original power grid, we built in multiple redundancies. But if someone rerouted the main feed without updating the backup protocols? Mom, what are you doing? Michael grabbed my arm as I reached for the door handle. I looked down at his hand, the same hand that had been controlling me all day, and something cold and sharp settled in my chest. Let me. The tone of my voice must have shocked him, because his grip loosened immediately. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw fear flicker across his face. Not the fear of a son worried about his mother's safety, but the fear of a man who was finally seeing the person he'd underestimated. Mrs. Penrose, Victoria said urgently, if you know something about the power systems. I know everything about the power systems, I said, opening the door. I designed them. The hallway was chaos. Residents shuffled along the walls, guided by staff members with flashlights. I could hear someone crying in one of the rooms, and the sound of medical equipment beeping frantically as battery backups kicked in. Janet! I called out to the young nurse who was helping an elderly man navigate with his walker. She turned, her face streaked with sweat and worry. Mrs. Penrose, you should stay in your room where it's safe. Where's the electrical room? The what? The main electrical room. Sub-basement level, probably near the laundry facility. Victoria appeared at my shoulder. How do you know about? Because I spent 3 years walking through this building during construction. I snapped, my patience finally wearing thin. Every pipe, every wire, every safety system. I approved it all. A new voice cut through the din. Excuse me. Coming through. It was Tom, the maintenance supervisor, pushing through the crowd with a flashlight and what looked like a two-way radio. He was a big man, probably in his 40s, with the kind of hands that spoke of years working with tools and machinery. Victoria, he called out when he saw her. We've got bigger problems. Mrs. Chen in room 304. Her ventilator's running on battery power, but it won't last more than 2 hours. My blood went cold. Mrs. Chen had been admitted 3 months ago after a stroke left her partially paralyzed and dependent on breathing assistance. Sweet woman who'd been a seamstress for 50 years before her body betrayed her. Can we move her to the hospital? Victoria asked. In this blackout, emergency services are swamped. Every traffic light in the city is down, and half the ambulances are stuck in gridlock. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Tom, I said, stepping forward into the beam of his flashlight. Take me to the electrical room. Now. He blinked confused. Ma'am, that's not really a place for. For what? For old ladies. I could feel something dangerous rising in my voice, something that had been buried under years of playing the role of harmless grandmother. Tom, I'm Clarissa Penrose. I built this place. And right now, I'm the only one who knows how to fix it. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Michael's voice behind me. Mom, you're scaring me. I turned to look at him, this son who tried to have me declared incompetent just hours ago, and laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Good, I said. You should be scared. Because you have no idea who you've been messing with. Tom looked between us, clearly confused by the family drama unfolding in the middle of his emergency. But Victoria stepped forward and put a hand on his arm. Tom, do what she says. If Mrs. Penrose thinks she can help, we don't have time to argue. But the insurance liability. Fuck the insurance, Victoria said, her professional composure finally cracking. We've got 200 people in this building who could die if we don't get power restored. Take her to the electrical room. Tom nodded grimly and gestured for me to follow. As we started moving through the crowded hallway, I heard Michael's voice behind us. Wait, Mom, this is insane. You don't know anything about electrical systems. I stopped and turned back to face him one more time. In the red emergency lighting, surrounded by the chaos he'd inadvertently walked into, my son looked smaller somehow. Younger. Like the little boy who used to wake me up during thunderstorms because he was afraid of the dark. But that little boy had grown up to be a man who would sell his own mother's freedom for money. And some betrayals couldn't be forgiven just because of shared DNA. "Michael," I said quietly, "you've spent the last 3 months telling everyone I'm losing my mind. That I'm incompetent. That I can't take care of myself." I paused, letting the weight of his accusations settle between us. "So why don't you sit down, shut up, and let the crazy old lady try to save some lives?" The look of hurt that crossed his face almost made me feel guilty. Almost. But then I heard Mrs. Chen's ventilator alarm beeping somewhere in the distance, and the guilt evaporated. Tom led us through a maze of service corridors I hadn't walked in years but still knew by heart. The emergency lighting was sporadic here, and our footsteps echoed off concrete walls that had witnessed the birth of my dream 37 years ago. "How long have you worked here, Tom?" I asked as we descended a narrow staircase. 12 years, he replied, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of us. "Started as an apprentice electrician right out of trade school. Then you would have worked with Harold Zimmerman." Tom stopped so suddenly I almost ran into him. "You knew Harry." "I hired him." I smiled in the darkness. "He was the best electrical foreman in the state. Taught me more about power systems than I ever wanted to know." "Harry used to talk about the woman who built this place," Tom said slowly, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Said she was tougher than any construction foreman he'd ever worked with. Said she'd crawl through conduits and climb electrical towers just to make sure everything was perfect." "That woman," I said, "is standing right behind you." When we reached the electrical room, Tom's flashlight revealed a space that was both familiar and foreign. The basic layout was exactly as I remembered. Main panels along the east wall, backup generators in the adjoining room, distribution boards organized by floor and function. But decades of upgrades and modifications had added layers of complexity that made my head spin. "Jesus," Tom muttered, playing his light over a tangle of new wiring that definitely hadn't been there during my time. "No wonder the backup system failed. Look at this mess." He was right. Someone, probably multiple contractors over the years, had run new circuits without properly documenting them. The clean, logical system Edmund and I had designed had become a spider's web of patches and workarounds. "Here," I said, moving to a panel I recognized. "This should be the main distribution for the backup generators. But these new circuits..." I traced a bundle of cables with my finger. "They're pulling power directly from the grid bypass. If the main feed goes down, the backup system can't engage because it's fighting against dead circuits." Tom aimed his flashlight where I was pointing. "Shit, you're right. But how do we fix it?" I was already rolling up my sleeves. "We isolate the grid bypass and force the system into emergency mode. But it means manually switching every floor panel. That could take hours. And in the dark. Then we better get started." For the next 90 minutes, Tom and I worked in the bowels of sunny gardens like a team that had been together for years. He provided the muscle and the modern electrical knowledge. I provided the institutional memory and the understanding of how the original systems were designed to interact. We crawled through spaces that would have challenged people half our age, traced circuits with nothing but flashlight beams and 30-year-old blueprints I carried in my head, and performed electrical surgery on systems that were keeping 200 people alive. And somewhere in that dark, cramped space, working side by side with a man young enough to be my grandson, I felt more alive than I had in months. "Try it now," I called out, my hands covered in dust and my knees protesting from crawling around on concrete floors. Tom threw the main switch, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, like a miracle, the lights came on. The sound that followed, cheers and applause echoing through the ventilation system from 3 floors above, was better than any symphony I'd ever heard. "Holy shit," Tom breathed, staring at me with something approaching reverence. "You actually did it." I was about to respond when I heard footsteps on the stairs behind us. Victoria appeared, followed by Michael and Janet, all of them blinking in the sudden brightness. "Mrs. Penrose," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I replied, wiping my hands on a shop rag. We need to document what we found here and make sure it doesn't happen again. And someone needs to have a serious conversation with whatever contractor created this mess. Already on it, Tom said, taking pictures of the jury-rigged wiring with his phone. This is definitely not up to code. Michael stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been pride. Mom, I had no idea you could do things like this. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the manipulative son who tried to have me committed, but a man who was genuinely struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman standing in front of him covered in electrical dust and holding a voltage tester. There's a lot about me you don't know, Michael, I said quietly. But that's what happens when you decide someone isn't worth listening to. Before he could respond, Janet's radio crackled to life. Emergency in room 237. Medical emergency in room 237. All available staff please respond. The blood drained from Victoria's face. That's Mrs. Patterson. And suddenly, our electrical victory felt very small compared to the possibility that we might have been too late to save the woman who'd been one of our very first residents, the retired librarian who'd trusted Edmund and me with her golden years, and who might now be paying the price for our family's dysfunction. Let's go, I said, but as we reached the stairs, Victoria's radio crackled again. Never mind the emergency call. False alarm. Mrs. Patterson just wanted to thank whoever got the lights back on. She said. There was a pause, then a chuckle. She said she knew the real boss would show up eventually. The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to grab Tom's arm for support. But it was Victoria's next words that sent a chill down my spine. Mrs. Penrose, she said slowly, there's something else. While you were down here saving everyone, I took the liberty of making some phone calls. About Michael's power of attorney documents. Michael went very still beside me. And? I asked, though I already suspected what she'd discovered. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. They're forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Which means, legally speaking, your son just attempted to commit fraud, elder abuse, and false imprisonment. The silence in that bright electrical room was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. And that's when someone started pounding on the door upstairs, shouting about police and warrants and how nobody was leaving until they got some answers. The pounding on the door grew louder, accompanied by voices that carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Victoria's face went pale as she looked between Michael and me, clearly realizing that her phone calls had set something in motion that none of us were prepared for. Police, open up. We have a warrant for wellness check and investigation of elder abuse. Michael's legs seemed to give out, and he sank onto a nearby electrical panel box, his head in his hands. Oh God, what have I done? You tried to steal my life, I said simply. But there was no satisfaction in watching him crumble. Just a deep, bone-weary sadness that it had come to this. Tom looked between us uncertainly. Should I go let them in? Yes, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. And Tom, thank you for everything you did today. As Tom's footsteps faded up the stairs, I found myself alone with the two people who represented the most complicated relationships of my life. The son who'd betrayed me, and the woman who'd preserved my legacy. Mrs. Penrose, Victoria said quietly, I want you to know that whatever happens next, you'll always have a home here. Not as a resident who was dumped by her family, but as the founder returning to the place she built. The offer was generous. More generous than I deserved after letting this situation spiral so far out of control. But as I looked around the electrical room, this concrete space where I just spent 90 minutes proving I was anything but helpless, I realized something important. I didn't want to hide here. Thank you, I said to Victoria, but I think it's time I went home. My real home. Michael's head snapped up. Mom, the house. I was going to put it on the market. The realtor said. The realtor, I interrupted, can go find another commission. That house has been in our family for 43 years. It's where I raised you and Sarah, where your father proposed to me, where he took his last breath. No amount of money is worth more than those memories. But the upkeep, the expenses. Michael. My voice cut through his protests like a blade. I have money. More money than you apparently realized. Money that I earned, invested, and saved over decades of hard work. Money that I was planning to leave to you and Sarah when I died. Not because you deserved it, but because I loved you. The past tense hung in the air between us like a ghost. Heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs, followed by the crackle of police radios. 2 officers appeared. A middle-aged woman with sergeant's stripes and a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Clarissa Penrose?" the sergeant asked, her eyes scanning the electrical room and clearly trying to make sense of the scene. "That's me. I'm Sergeant Martinez, this is Officer Brooks. We received calls about a possible elder abuse situation and falsified documents. Are you all right, ma'am?" I looked at Michael, slumped on his electrical panel, then at Victoria, who was watching me with careful eyes, then back at the officers who were here to protect me from my own son. "Officer," I said slowly, "that's a complicated question." For the next 2 hours, we sat in Victoria's office while I told the whole story. The forged documents, the manipulation, the lies Michael had told Sarah to get her to agree to the nursing home placement. The officers took notes, asked questions, and occasionally exchanged glances that suggested they'd seen this kind of family dysfunction before. Michael sat silent through most of it, occasionally trying to interrupt with explanations that made him sound worse, not better. He talked about his divorce expenses, his business struggles, how he'd only been thinking of my safety. But with each excuse, he sounded more like a stranger wearing my son's face. "The thing is," Sergeant Martinez said when I'd finished, "technically, your son did commit several crimes here. The forged power of attorney alone is a felony. But..." She looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested she had elderly parents of her own. "Prosecution would be difficult without your cooperation, Mrs. Penrose. And given that no lasting harm was done, you're saying it's up to me. I'm saying you have options." I looked at Michael, really looked at him, and tried to find some trace of the little boy who used to climb into bed with Edmund and me during thunderstorms. The teenager who'd brought his dates home for dinner so I could embarrass him with baby pictures. The young man who'd cried at his father's funeral and promised he'd always take care of me. That person was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of desperation and bad decisions and the kind of entitlement that comes from assuming other people exist for your convenience. "Michael," I said quietly, "look at me." He raised his head, and I saw that he'd been crying. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the raw, ugly crying of a person who'd finally understood what they'd lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I was just..." Everything was falling apart and I thought. "You thought I was weak," I finished for him. "You thought I was just some helpless old lady you could push around and nobody would care. No, that's not. That's exactly what you thought." I stood up, and everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. "But here's what you didn't understand, Michael. I've been taking care of myself since before you were born. I built a business from nothing, raised 2 children, buried a husband, and created something that's brought comfort to thousands of people over the decades. I am not weak. I am not helpless. And I am certainly not stupid." Michael nodded miserably. "I know that now. Do you?" I moved to the window overlooking the garden where residents were now enjoying the evening air, grateful for lights and air conditioning and medical equipment that worked. "Because what you did today wasn't just about money or power of attorney or nursing homes. What you did was try to erase me. Turn me into a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. That wasn't. I didn't mean. But you did mean it. Every forged signature, every lie you told Sarah, every time you grabbed my arm like I was your property instead of your mother. You meant it all." Sergeant Martinez cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Penrose, what would you like us to do?" I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about second chances and consequences and the difference between justice and revenge. "I want the forged documents destroyed," I said finally. "I want Michael to pay back every penny he borrowed against my house without permission. And yes, Michael, I knew about that too. I want him to apologize to Sarah for lying to her about my condition. And I want him to understand that his inheritance just got significantly smaller. Mom, I'm not finished. I turned back to face him. I also want you to come to dinner next Sunday. And the Sunday after that. And every Sunday for the next year. So we can figure out how to rebuild some kind of relationship that doesn't involve you treating me like a burden. The hope that flickered in his eyes was almost painful to watch. You'd do that. After everything. I'm your mother, Michael. That doesn't stop just because you acted like an ass. I sat back down, suddenly feeling every one of my 68 years. But it also doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. Trust once broken takes time to rebuild. If it can be rebuilt at all. Sergeant Martinez made some notes. And the criminal charges. I looked at Michael one more time, seeing him not as the son who'd betrayed me or the man who'd tried to steal my freedom, but as a human being who'd made terrible choices and would have to live with the consequences. No charges, I said. But I want this documented. If anything like this ever happens again, to me or to anyone else, I want there to be a paper trail. Understood. As the officers prepared to leave, Victoria walked them to the door, leaving Michael and me alone for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun. Mom, he said quietly, why are you giving me another chance? After what I did? It was a good question and I took my time answering it. Because, I said finally, 37 years ago, your father and I built this place because we believe that everyone deserves dignity in their final years. Everyone deserves to be cared for by people who see them as human beings, not problems to be solved. And that includes you, Michael. You're lost right now, making decisions based on fear instead of love. But you're still my son. And I still have hope that you can be better than the person you were today. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't deserve you. No, I agreed, you don't. But love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to see the best in someone even when they're showing you their worst. Victoria returned as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through her office windows. The officers are gone. And Mrs. Penrose. There's something else. The story of what you did today. Fixing the power, saving Mrs. Chan and all the other residents. It's already spreading through the building. People are asking if you're really the founder. If you're really the woman who built this place. I smiled, thinking about Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Henderson and all the other residents who'd trusted Edmund and me with their golden years. What did you tell them? I told them, Victoria said, that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. And sometimes they look like retired English teachers who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty when people need help. As we prepared to leave, Michael hovering uncertainly beside me, Victoria handed me a key card. What's this? Honorary access, she said. To every part of the building anytime you want to visit. Not as a resident but as family. Because that's what you are to everyone here, family. The drive home was quiet, Michael behind the wheel of his car while mine sat in the Sunny Gardens parking lot where he'd left it that morning. We'd get it tomorrow, along with sorting out a dozen other details that would need attention. But tonight I was just tired. Mom, Michael said as we pulled into my driveway of the house that was still mine. Yeah, what you did today in that electrical room. Dad would have been proud. I looked up at the house Edmund and I had shared for so many years, with its front porch where we'd watched sunsets and its garden where he'd taught our children to plant tomatoes. Your father, I said, would have been furious that it took a power outage for you to remember who raised you. Michael winced, but he didn't argue. He helped me out of the car and walked me to the front door, where I turned to face him one last time. Sunday dinner, I said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. I'll be there. And Michael, next time you think your mother is losing her mind, maybe ask her about it instead of forging legal documents. Despite everything, he almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. As his taillights disappeared down the street, I stood on my front porch and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, Mrs. Chen was breathing easily thanks to her restored ventilator. Mrs. Patterson was probably reading in her favorite chair under proper lighting. Mr. Henderson was safe and comfortable in the place Edmund and I had built for people just like him. And tomorrow there would be new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to prove that age is just a number and that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the house that had always been my home. The house where I'd raised my children, loved my husband, and would now spend my remaining years on my own terms. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with something better. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the moment came to choose between bitterness and hope, between giving up and fighting back, I'd chosen to be exactly who Edmund had always said I was. Strong enough to build something beautiful. Wise enough to know when to forgive. And stubborn enough to never, ever let anyone else decide what my life was worth. The lights in my house worked perfectly, just like they always had. And just like they always would.